Grace and peace to you from the one who is, and who was, and who is to come. There's a story that in the 1980s, Pablo Escobar was making so much money, all of it in cash, that his accountants couldn't launder it fast enough to get it all into the bank. So Pablo, who probably doesn't get talked about in church all that often, put millions of dollars of cash in crates and buried them in the ground. As the tide in that war on drugs turned against him, all of Pablo's assets were frozen. He needed that money to buy protection. He dug up what he had buried and found crates full of rotten, worthless paper. Pablo had stored up lots of treasure for himself and had counted on all that cash to keep him safe. But when the time came, all the treasure he had stored up for himself failed him. Now, I feel safe in assuming that no one here has ever had to bury millions of dollars of drug money in a hole in the ground. But I'm equally sure that each and every one of us faces our own struggles in our relationship with money. This relationship raises questions for us all. How do we decide when we have enough? How do we use it responsibly? How do we teach our children values that will equip them to have a good relationship with money? And as people who want to grow into devoted disciples of Jesus Christ, what does our faith have to say about money? Now, while I'm asking questions about money, let me ask one more and invite you to respond with a show of hands. How many of you are either saving for retirement or currently are retired? I see. I think that means most of us can see a little bit of ourselves in the story Jesus tells today. A man is blessed with great success at his work. He looks to the future and says to himself, "What should I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I'll do this. I'll pull down my barns and build larger ones. And there I'll store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.'" Unlike Pablo, this man comes by his money honestly, and this man doesn't squander the windfall that comes his way. But like Pablo, this man assumes that money will meet every need he has. Then, the one and only time in any of Jesus' parables where God speaks directly, God calls this man a fool. This very night, God says, your life is being demanded of you. Then everything you've prepared, whose will it be? Jesus sums up this short, harsh story by saying, this is how it will be for people who store up treasure for themselves, but aren't rich toward God. I think Jesus' final comment helps us hear what God is saying to us here today. Jesus said God offers this kind of judgment for people who store up treasure for themselves. If we listen to what the man in the story says in light of Jesus' comment, we can hear how this man is all about me, myself, and I. What should I do? Because I have no place to store my stuff. I will do this. I'll pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I'll store my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, "Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." Just a few weeks ago, we heard Jesus affirm that faithful living grows from loving God and loving neighbor. This man doesn't show even the slightest love for or even awareness of God or neighbor as he makes plans for his money. He doesn't look for a way to return any of this blessing to God, who gave it to him in the first place, or to use any of it to bless his neighbor. Instead, his relationship with money distorts how he sees his relationship to everything and everyone else. He starts to believe that having enough money allows him, as Pastor David Lose wrote, to transcend the everyday vulnerabilities and needs that remind us we're mortal, created beings, ultimately and always dependent on others, and especially on God. The man in Jesus' story made his relationship with money a higher priority than his relationship with God or neighbor. This is what makes him a fool. we aren't called to be fools. We're called to be faithful stewards, growing rich toward God by growing in how generously we give back to God and how generously we give to bless our neighbor. The story Jesus tells this morning isn't a statement about money being good or bad. The story Jesus invites us to examine our relationship with money in light of the other relationships where we live out our faith. The relationships we have with our neighbors and the relationship we have with God. If we look at our relationship with money in light of the relationship we have with God, that relationship that has been redeemed and restored through the cross and the empty tomb, we hear a message about money that's at odds with so much of what the rest of the world is telling us about money. Where the world says your worth as a person depends on how much money you have, the good news of the gospel proclaims that our worth doesn't depend on what belongs to us. Our worth depends on our belonging to God. This gospel helps us ask different questions about our relationship with money. Where the world asks, how can you get more money? People who want to grow in faith are called to ask, is money or the pursuit of it taking priority over loving God and loving neighbor? Where the world asks, do you have enough money for what you want? Faithful disciples are called to ask, do we believe that we can use money, no matter how much or how little of it we have, as a means to love God or love neighbor? And where the world says, you can't take it with you, God asks, the things you have prepared, whose will they be? As people who trust the promise of the resurrection, we know that while we can't take it with us, God can bring new life to what God has given us that we leave behind. This fall, we have the chance to walk through a unique intersection of money, faithful stewardship, and resurrection. On September 7th and 8th, we're going to welcome Chris Burnett from the ELCA Foundation, who will share ways that we can have a say in who will receive the gifts that God entrusts to us in this life that we leave behind. Chris is going to help us learn about ways we can give now so that we can see the impact of our generosity, and ways we can create a plan that will allow us to answer that question God asks. The things we have prepared, whose will they be? I hope you'll be a part of this opportunity to learn new ways of being good stewards and helping to grow, as Jesus says, rich toward God. No matter how much or how little of it we have, we're all affected by our relationship with money. It can be a healthy relationship, one that helps us learn to use a tool we need so that we can live. But it can also be an abusive relationship, one that drives us to do things that are bad for us, bad for our neighbor, and bad for God. As we navigate this relationship, we don't have to find our way all by ourselves. Our faith grounds us in our relationship with God, a relationship that's been restored and redeemed by Jesus' death and resurrection. Our worth comes from this relationship. So the relationship we have with money doesn't have to be about storing up treasure for ourselves, but can be about growing rich toward God by giving back to God and giving to bless our neighbors. And because God has already been rich toward us in the promise of the resurrection, we know that we will eat, drink, and be joyful, not around our table, but at God's feast that has no end. Thanks be to God.